Welcome back. In this video, I'll continue my coverage of Chapter 13, Prejudice, by talking about Learning Objective 13.2. Explain how we measure prejudices that people don't want to show or that they don't know that they hold. You're probably familiar with terms like implicit bias or hidden prejudices. How do social psychologists go about studying these things? Well, before we talk about specific methodologies, in addition to the one you've already learned about, the study that I described in the previous video about the shooter bias is one of the ways that we do that, is by having, quick judgment, behaviors that people have to exhibit that are designed to uncover automatically processed thoughts or emotions. The reason why we need to do this is because some people who have prejudiced attitudes will actively suppress those feelings so that they won't be labeled as racist or sexist or whatever. Now, most of us have prejudices. I would argue all of us have some prejudices, and some of them we would rather not have. One of the architects of the implicit bias measure that we'll talk about in a little bit, she talked in one of the videos that she created in describing the implicit attitudes test, she refers to as an ageistic prejudice that she has. And she didn't know that she really had it until she took an implicit attitudes test looking at ageistic attitudes, and it revealed that she had some hidden biases against older people. And then when she reflected on it further, she found lots of examples in her own thinking, in her own behavior, that really did connect up with that, even though she wasn't consciously aware that she had this underlying kind of hidden prejudice toward people who were older. So some people will actively suppress their attitudes, but some people will suppress them. They will actively suppress their attitudes so that they're not labeled with negative terms, but they're not really worried about the fact that they're actually that way. Still, other prejudiced people will suppress their true feelings because they want to change their minds. Now, lots of people will say, and I kind of felt like this when I went to college in the 80s, because I was raised in an almost entirely white area of Ohio, and I didn't have, outside of athletics, I had virtually no opportunity to interact with people who didn't look like me. And through, just being a heavy reader and enjoying my sports encounters with people who were not like me, I really wanted to learn more. At the same time, I was raised in an environment where racism was not uncommon. So those prejudices were all around me. And it could be very hard to really challenge those prejudices when you don't have anything to challenge them with. So for me, it was a lot about really trying to change my information base. So the stereotypes that were crammed into my head based on the way I was raised, the context that I was living in, the media I was exposed to, how do I suppress that or how do I change it? So regardless of the motive, whether you're trying to hide your feelings so you don't have social consequences, or you're actively trying to change the way your mind is working to process information about other people, you still have some hidden prejudices. So how do we get at these implicitly held prejudices that we're not necessarily consciously aware of? There are many, as I mentioned before, techniques for doing this. One that's been used fairly often to uncover bias in hiring is to send identical resumes to potential employers and then have them evaluate them. What the researchers will do with these resumes is they'll manipulate some of the information to suggest that a person is of a particular sex, a particular race, a particular religious orientation, and so on. So they may do some manipulation of the language, using names, using other kinds of nuggets of information so that people will make judgments. Now, they may not even be aware that that's what they're doing, but the effects are crystal clear. So you can have a resume that suggests a particular race or gender, and that resume will be responded to in ways that are consistent with stereotypes. So, for example, if it's an engineering firm and you have a resume that appears to be for a female, they will be evaluated more harshly. If it's for a nursing position, however, and the resume appears to be for a male, that male will be judged more harshly, right? So that's one technique. Another technique is something called the bogus pipeline, which is a weird name for what this technique actually involves. It's actually a very old technique. Basically, researchers would bring participants in and sit them down with this fancy looking box with some wires, and they will be told that this is a lie detector machine. It's a very sophisticated machine. It's 100% effective in detecting lying. And then they'll ask them some questions. So participants were randomly assigned in some of this research to conditions where they either were wired up to the bogus pipeline, the fake lie detector, or they weren't. And people tended to own up to their negative prejudicial attitudes more often when they were hooked up to the fake lie detector machine than was the case when they were not. So if they felt like they were going to be caught lying about their prejudicial attitudes, they tended to be more honest under those circumstances. Otherwise, they lie. So that's another technique, and that really hits more at that first bullet point from the last slide, where you have a person who wants to hide their negative attitudes so that they won't be socially judged. So the bogus pipeline is better for that. Then you have the type of test that can uncover the second bullet point from the previous slide. When people have implicit attitudes that they're not consciously aware are kind of floating around in there, but nevertheless can impact their behaviors. So let's dig into the implicit attitudes test a little bit more. And I will say at the outset, there are critics of this test. So, and they have good reasons for the criticism. So we need to think about what are the limits. What can the IAT test tell us? Because it can tell us some really important things. But also, what can't it tell us? So I'll circle back around to that statement after we kind of lay out what the IAT test does. What the IAT test does, it measures how quickly you can make positive and negative reactions to various target groups. There are versions of the IAT that have been created for many different target groups, from groups defined by race, by religion, by income, by employment, so their type of career, by disability status, by weight status, by age status, etc. So any kind of stereotyped group that you can think of, there's an IAT for it. You can actually, if you get onto Google and you put in implicit attitudes test, and you go to the original site, you can take those tests and basically add to their database. But you can also be informed as to what your implicit attitudes are. Now, IAT results could mean, and this is where we circle back around to, what can the IAT tell you and what can't it tell you? It can suggest that you actually are prejudiced and you know it, but it might not. So let's keep digging. Some psychological scientists say that what the IAT actually captures is cultural stereotypes. So what you've been exposed to, what are the most common beliefs about various groups of people that surround you? What have you absorbed? And then that may translate into chronically accessible beliefs. Remember that phrase chronically accessible, what that means is once it's triggered, a particular stereotype category is super easy to bring to the surface if it's chronically accessible. So some prejudice attitudes are chronically accessible. The question becomes, how likely is it when you have a chronically accessible implicit attitude about a particular group, how likely is that to translate into actual discriminatory behavior? That's the part that we don't know about. So the IAT can show you what are your tendencies toward certain target groups in terms of your chronically accessible beliefs. That's what it does. What does it not do? It cannot be used to screen you for employment, right? Most of what you have probably learned about the IAT testing is in the context of companies or police forces or educational institutions doing what's called implicit bias training, where they try and teach people by giving them implicit attitudes tests what their hidden prejudices are. That was never the intention of the creators of the test. The creators of the test were really interested in something very specific. What are some of the ways that we can access these chronically accessible thoughts that people are unaware they actually have? And that's a really tricky thing to do. Research shows us that individual differences, so comparing people with other people in the AIT, suggests that some people hold stereotypes more strongly than others. So some people will show really strong implicit attitudes, whereas other people have weaker ones. And that's interesting in and of itself because that can show the variation from person to person in the degree to which they may be vulnerable to being influenced by those implicit attitudes. Some research, not all, but some research shows that the higher a person's IAT score in whatever domain, the more likely they are to discriminate. But you shouldn't take that too far because there are variations across people. There's some studies that don't show that effect. The studies that do show the effect tend to suggest that it is a likelihood, but not a one-to-one relationship. So just because you have a high IAT score in a particular domain doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to actively discriminate against a target. What it means is that you may be statistically more likely, but it doesn't mean that you, as an individual, are more likely. And that's tricky. Actually, when people are asked to say, where are your strongest implicit biases, many people are aware. They can be very accurate when they're asked to predict what kind of implicit prejudices they have. That's not always the case, but it can occur. Now, going back to this middle bullet point here, some psychological scientists think it simply captures cultural associations or stereotypes. Let's talk about that a little more. I found this graphic. It's based on research that's associated with the IAT test, looking specifically at one particular automatic association. So here that they would be asking questions about careers and family. And one of the things that has been found is that you're looking at the percent of respondents who participated in the IAT research online, who got each score, and you can kind of think of this as a scale from 1 to 7. 1 being flipping the script. So think about stereotypes about gender: male associated with family, female associated with career. You can see in a US sample, very unlikely. You go the opposite direction: strong automatic association of male with career, female with family, and you get about 25% of the population. And then a moderate association between male and career, female family, 32. So if you combine those, you've got a whopping 56% who have an automatic kind of association that connects masculinity with career and femininity with family. Those are beliefs that are consistent with traditional gender role norms in U.S. culture. Not everyone believes them, but it's significant enough in our cultural context that even people who don't live their lives that way tend to have a strong automatic association between them, because so much of our cultural rhetoric, so much of our cultural exposures push us in that direction. So be very careful when you're thinking about the IAT test. It's not showing that you're a sexist or a racist. What it's showing is the way in which stereotypes can become really woven into the fabric of the way we see the world. So it's very informative for us as individuals when we take these tests, and it can really provide us with a way of saying, okay, I know how strong this association is in my mind. How do I feel about that association? And is there a way for me to modify that? Now, later in the chapter, we'll come back to this issue of how do we confront and challenge and change our automatic preferences. And that will be when we start talking later in the chapter. In the next video, though, we're going to look at ways in which prejudice affects its target when we talk about Learning Objective 13.3.